Hey, Herle Burlyites. A real treat today. My longtime friend and mentor, Bill Fox, is with us. Bill was first a working journalist and now is a leading academic analyst of media and communications. Bill is super smart. Bill combines like 18 university degrees with the common sense that comes from being raised in Timmins. Bill has worked at the highest levels of journalism, government, and business. And he's among the best storytellers you will ever find. And because he's just written a book, he's here to share all of that with us. The book is Trump, Trudeau, Tweets, and Truth, A Conversation by Bill Fox. Fantastic book. My God, there's so much information in there. Bill, fantastic to have you here with us today. How are you?
I'm really well, David, and I'm delighted to have this chance to have a conversation with you about some of the issues that are set out in that book.
Now, before we get to the book, because it's on my mind and I've got you here, I got to get your opinion on something. So, the Conservatives appear poised to choose Pierre Poilievre as their leader, and the Liberals have just signed an arrangement with the NDP to govern for the next 3 years. Is something changing in Canadian politics?
Well, yes, but we shouldn't assume that hasn't always been the case. There's a famous story in political circles about then British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan being asked, what might throw his government off its agenda? And his answer was, events, dear boy, events. And that was in the 1960s. Our political circumstance always shifts, and you can never anticipate what the other side might do. And you have to be very careful not to be locked into an assessment of what might happen that doesn't allow you to kind of recalibrate if something else happens.
Do you think that if we're polarizing more toward left and right political parties, is that related to anything in your book?
Oh, yeah, for sure. In democracies, in Western liberal democracies, we're all familiar with the phrase, the tyranny of the majority, right? Well, in first past the post systems like ours, it actually rarely is the tyranny of the majority. It's almost always the tyranny of a plurality. Right. And in the context of leadership campaigns...
Except in your case.
Except in our case in 1984.
Yeah.
And if you think about it in the context of leadership campaigns, which the Conservative Party is now going through, it's actually the tyranny of a micro-minority. So you're really getting into, pretty small samples and groups. And not surprisingly, if you're talking about activists, you are by definition dealing with people that feel the most strongly about the philosophy and or the kind of worldview that party espouses. And so the conversation tends to be dominated by people at the sharp end of either end of the spectrum. So not surprisingly, in the Conservative leadership campaign, you have a conversation that so far at least has been driven, largely but with populist rhetoric, although in fairness to some of the other candidates, they are actively trying to change that. And given the events of this week in Ottawa, not surprisingly, there are a lot of people focused on the far end of the left side of the progressive agenda, given the arrangement that the Prime Minister has struck with the leader of the New Democratic Party, Jagmeet Singh.
Okay, this book, man, it feels, I know that you at some point sat down to craft a book, but it feels like the work of a lifetime.
It is. It emphatically is. And, it's And so I don't have a whole lot of professional runway in front of me. So I, not surprisingly, have tended to look a little bit back to the runway that I've already used up. But I was seized of one thing. Fundamentally, it's the story of a pivot. And by a pivot, I don't mean the political talking head pivot of, ask me about fish and I'll tell you about wheat. I mean the pivot of an athlete, the transfer of power, of motion, of acceleration, of execution. That's what we're living and experiencing right now. And what that means in practical terms is you have a distribution shift triggered by technology, i.e. the internet. And as a consequence of that distribution shift, you've had a discourse shift. So the way we talk to each other is fundamentally different than it was not that many years ago. And, one of the things about being an old man is that, I've lived through a couple of these shifts. When I was a very young reporter, in fact, when I first started to work in the newsroom, I wasn't a reporter. I was a copy boy. And there were no copy girls in those days, by the way. And my job involved, trying to make certain I remembered whether the news editor wanted his coffee with 2 cream and 1 sugar or 2 sugar and 1 cream. And my progress was going to be measured based on how well I remembered that. But when I first started, print journalism was the dominant site of political conversation. And not very long after I started as a journalist, it began to shift. And it began to shift to broadcasting generally, but to television particularly. And television affected a fundamental way we talked about politics in a way that, I readily concede wasn't obvious to me in the early years of my career, but became strikingly obvious to me later. So we're going through a similar thing now. And whether the channels that were once relatively limited, network TV, big newspapers, local radio, are now, so varied that you hesitate to start naming because you're gonna miss all kinds of them. But it's Facebook and it's Twitter and it's TikTok and it's and the way you kind of connect with people through all those things is really very different than what you used to do in the more traditional or legacy media system.
So the way you describe that, you talk about there's been change before, this is change is inevitable. It sounds benign, but I don't get the impression from your book that you think these changes are benign.
I don't think they're benign. And further, I think that you have to take advantage of those changes to change some of the things you do. The mystery novelist Rita Mae Brown, famously said, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. And so we can't practice the kind of media, for instance, that developed over the era of network TV and weekly news magazines and big dailies in this new social media universe. It would be a mistake. And it would be to the detriment of not just media, but to the detriment of society and to the detriment of democracy. To me, it's no accident that Western liberal democracies are under siege or in trouble everywhere, and there's a commonality to the expressions of frustration that you hear, whether it's in the UK or the United States or in Canada. Populist rhetoric, its point of departure is some form of kind of economic uncertainty linked invariably to some form of cultural disruption. And the messaging always has 3 component parts. And the first is a reference to the people. And the second is a reference to some sort of corrupt elite. And the third is a reference to some sort of displacement or exclusion. You know? And I say that acknowledging that for a lot of those people, you know, who are of that view, that I would be the personification of what constitutes an elite.
So Bill, I was like, that's basic storytelling, isn't it?
Yeah.
Isn't that basic storytelling? Like I have been saying to liberals for years that one of our storytelling problems versus populists is that we don't have a villain in our story. We won't identify, people know things are going wrong. The populists identify the causes, the villains of the story. Liberals won't identify who the villain is.
Well, look, there's no question in politics, it's always handy to have an external enemy, right? And whether it's Donald Trump or others, many have settled on mainstream or legacy media as the external enemy. And it's an absolute fact of life that one of the very best ways to get media coverage is to attack the media. You know, they're like, it's like catnip for them. They can't resist, right? But having said that, you know, it's not that there aren't ways to engage for people of a liberal, traditional classical liberal persuasion. But here's the problem that I see. Knowledge is the basic economic commodity of our society. Knowledge, right? And that's sometimes a challenge for Canadians in particular. For those of us that grew up in mining towns, or those of us who grew up in communities where people, the forestry was the driver, or for those of us who grew up on the oil patch, right? But the fact is, the management gurus, the Peter Druckers of the world have been telling us for some time that knowledge is the basic economic entity. But the people with that knowledge have a responsibility to those who are less involved in it to kind of explain it, to walk through it, to help them understand how it connects directly to their lives. And that's where we failed. We, the possessors of that knowledge, haven't done enough to help people appreciate where knowledge fits into the equation. And I'll give you this is going to sound like a crazy example, but many, many years ago when I was in the consulting business, I used to do a lot of work with people involved in the softwood lumber industry. And, if you're a certain age and you think of a lumber mill, you think of, a lot of men with saws cutting away and, labor intensive work. But one day I found myself in one of those mills. And first of all, it wasn't just men. It was men and women. Secondly, they were sitting at computer screens, and that's what they were using to cut the lumber. So this notion that, of laptop world that you'll hear people say in a disparaging way, well, the laptop world's in a lot of parts of our world. But as I say, I think where our failure is that we haven't spent enough time helping people get to that. And I would argue further, David, that maybe news is a contributing factor to that failure to explain.
In what way? Can you follow up on that?
Yeah. So news news is by definition exception based. Okay. I mean, there's been no headline proclaiming the fact, plane lands since Lindbergh in Paris in the 1920s, because planes are supposed to land.
Right.
So what makes the headline, as was the case this week in China, when a plane doesn't land? So by definition, because of news and its requirement for novelty and its requirement for conflict and its requirement for, kind of something that's out of the ordinary, how today is different from yesterday, we always there's a tendency in news to feature the exemption, what's different. And what that means in practice is especially when it comes to political conversation, is it tends to focus on failure. So we don't write stories about everything that works in government. We write stories about this specific circumstance where it didn't work. And the way we structure news, especially television news, it's here's the problem. Here's the person that has the power and or authority to either alleviate the problem or compound the problem. And here's what we think about how they did that. And, you know, so I'll use the Canada Emergency Program from the pandemic for illustrative purposes. Think about it this way. First of all, as a kind of a point of departure, our businesses and our people fundamentally said, because of the pandemic and the shutdowns, we are in economic difficulty, not measured in weeks or months, but days. Okay? The basic message was, I'm not going to be able to pay my rent at the end of the month. Right? So the government puts together a program that literally people, you know, apply on a Tuesday and the money's in their account before the week's up.
Right. It's amazing.
Right. Now, by any reasonable measure, that's just a stunning success. But we in the media, or when I was in the media, we would tend to write the story about the poor individual who didn't get their check, where the money didn't arrive. And so there's, you know, Tom Patterson at Harvard has written a lot about this. So there's this sort of weird, you know, it's not an ideological bias. And I don't want to suggest that the reporters that write those stories have a bias one way or the other, but it becomes a de facto anti-government bias. Right. It becomes a reinforcing of the idea with people that governments actually don't get much done that's of any benefit. And that's problematic for Western liberal democracies, for sure.
Herle Burlyites, what's been on our mind these past couple of years more than our health? The list of answers to that question is short. The pandemic has laid bare a lot of things, not the least of which is the need to access the healthcare and health innovations we need virtually, from our own homes and from other remote locations. The continuing evolution of 5G and 5G-enabled tech is what makes that possible. You don't need me to tell you that the equitable delivery of public health care is a deeply embedded value in this country. Our presenting sponsor, TELUS, knows it. That's why TELUS believes that we've got to get 5G wireless connectivity right across all of Canada, in our biggest cities and all rural, remote, and Indigenous communities too, so that everyone has access. This is chapter 9 in our 5G story. Can I get that surgery takeout? Don't chuckle. Healthcare is forever innovating, and now we're entering a period where augmented reality, remote real-time monitoring, mobile MRI machines, and CT scanners on connected ambulances can push critical and specialized care from the emergency room and operating theater right into any community across the country. It won't surprise you to learn that 95% of specialists and surgeons are in Canada's biggest cities. Well, Teleview is a 5G-enabled startup choosing Canada and piloting on TELUS's network that brings specialized care to remote areas. They've field-tested the technology for things like standard health check-ins all the way to colorectal surgery remotely, connecting doctors in different locations with smart glasses technology and cloud-based patient monitoring. It's pretty heady stuff. But there's a big kink in that healthcare delivery chain. Right now, only 37% of rural Canada has reliable high-speed connectivity. We've talked about that here before. Too many carriers failing to build networks in rural Canada. But TELUS is, and they're fighting for policies that accelerate rural builds. They know the faster we get 5G to everyone in Canada, the more equitable and efficient our healthcare system becomes. More on 5G and healthcare next week, but you can have your say now at telus.com/get5G right. So one of the things you talk a lot about in the book, and one of the things that gets talked about a lot generally, is the decline of the traditional media journalist business model and the disappearance of newspapers and the diminishing relevance of television news. I have to feel, though, that people are getting right now exactly what they want. I mean, these trends are generally considered to be negative trends, perhaps even crises for democracy. But as I know people, A, they're not that interested in news or politics. B, they don't like their existing thinking to be challenged by opposing points of view. They like their thinking to be confirmed. C, they prioritize, as you can ask anybody who listens to music or creates music, that they prioritize convenience and free over quality and if it costs money. So free news of the kind I want that reinforces my opinions, conveniently located where I am naturally visiting with my friends on Facebook anyway, is probably a media model people are comfortable with.
Well, and they will be until they find out that most editorial content, regardless of the platform, is actually derivative, right? Let's stick to kind of mainstream media just for a second. So we in Canada in the last few years had an extended debate around the renewal of the trade agreement with the United States of America and Mexico. And if you turned on, the panel shows at 5 o'clock on the cable networks, if you turned on the nationals, if you read the front, the columnists in all of the newspapers, people went on and on and on and on about, the implications of all of this. The fact of the matter is the number of people that were covering those negotiations on the ground full time, I would suggest you could count on the fingers of one hand, right? Now, fortunately for Canada, one of them was Alex Panetta, who at that time was the CP correspondent in Washington and is an outstanding reporter. And I guess I'd say, and it's a damn good job because all the rest of us were basically operating off it, core information that he was providing. When you started, I wanted to say, my flippant answer would be media that we do want it free, but we also are starting to appreciate the risk when that core person that feeds the rest of the ecosystem isn't going to be there. I don't want to sound like an old timer whining about the 6-team NHL. Emphatically not, because I'm actually excited about some of the prospects that social media present. But when I first started as a young reporter and decided I wanted to be a political reporter, there was a kind of almost an apprenticeship. And you started out covering suburban councils and suburban school boards, but you went to planning boards. And I remember, when I'm in Ottawa now, I drive through thriving communities of significant populations that were the subject of the discussions at planning boards in township councils when I was starting out. But my point is, we were there. We covered that. And that information fed into a broader community conversation about what kind of communities these are going to be. And that in turn allowed people to go on talk radio and panel TV and all the rest of it. But all of that was predicated on an assumption that there was a kind of a core knowledge set. And a scholar at Harvard, Alex Jones, not to be confused with the person of the right of social media fame in the United States. He referred to that as and I quote directly, the iron core of journalism. That these were the basic facts that allowed the rest of us to have a common conversation. And that was reinforced by things like network TV, because network TV had three properties, right? The first was it helped set an agenda, right? The second was it primed us to consider leaders based on that agenda and how well they were performing against it. And then the third was a kind of a bandwagon element where we would know how we were all reacting to that. So it was a three-step process, but in the end, it did two things. One, it identified a relatively common agenda. And two, it changed, as David Moskrop says, it changed the criteria for assessing a leader, right? Now, we've got a really good example of that in the context of the pandemic. Procurement ministers in Canada, historically, we only hear about them when there's a problem, right? When we can't buy airplanes or can't build ships or whatever it is. But at a certain point, vaccines and access to vaccine became our collective preoccupation. And the procurement minister of that time, Anita Anand, was seen as somebody that delivered on that proposition. And so now all of a sudden, somebody who's relatively new to politics is now part of the conversation around, the potential for a successor to Mr. Trudeau, if and when he decides to pursue something else in his life. So that's a classic illustration of how this worked. Well, one of the challenges of this kind of diversity of channels and therefore diversity of voices is it's harder for us to come to that sort of shared agenda. And it's why something like the Ukraine is so striking, because it has done that. Yeah. But in the main, there are a lot of days where we can collectively come off sounding like the construction crew in the Tower of Babel. We're all having conversations, not with each other, that many of us are blissfully unaware are even happening, with a language that we may or may not find acceptable or tolerable, but that is being conducted on all kinds of channels that were not part of the mix not that long ago.
So we are now firmly in the grip of spring. The season's first official day was Sunday. Soon Canadians will be out there pushing the season, soaking up precious warmth, trying to get rid of our doughy winter look. And along with the snow, some of the grimmer aspects of the past 6 months are melting away too. It looks like we're getting past the Omicron wave. Provinces are dropping vaccine and mask mandates. The federal government has done away with testing requirements at the border. We'll see how all that works out, but it feels like the clouds are parting for the first time in ages. Here comes the sun. And nobody knows better how tough the fall and winter were than our sponsor, CN. Late last fall, atmospheric rivers flooded BC, turning the lower mainland into an island, cutting off cargo shipments to and from our main West Coast seaport. Then one of the harshest winters in years descended. For weeks on end, it was so cold that railways were forced to shorten trains and slow them down. Backlogs built up. CN is still dealing with the knock-on effects of all that, although it has made great progress in getting things back to normal. As spring proceeds, CN's thousands of railroaders are working overtime to fulfill cargo shipments safely and on time. The railway knows that with the war taking place in Europe, the world is even more dependent on our grain farmers. Right now, more than ever, Canada's economy moves on CN's network. CN will stay focused on its customers. It's a matter of public service. Bill, one of the things, and you give this some space in the book, are people, including practitioners of journalism, who say that the blame here for the decline of traditional media rests with traditional media, that it wasn't good enough, it didn't understand its audience well enough, it didn't adapt to new technologies or business models well enough. And I really have a difficult time understanding that, because it seems to me that the news was always subsidized and the news was always almost incidental. So TV TV networks, as you lay out in the book, were obligated to do news in order to get the licenses, the broadcast licenses. So that was part of their service back to the community to cover news. When it comes to newspapers, how many people bought newspapers for the news? By the time you got through people who bought it for the classified ads or bought it for the movie listings or bought it for the sports section, those people may, through the process of skimming the paper, encounter that there was a corrupt developer that bought the local city council. But they bought it for the classifieds.
Yeah.
So hasn't news always been subsidized by other things? And isn't that the core problem now, is that it's been delinked from all those subsidies?
Well, for
internal cross subsidies?
Yeah, I mean, you're quite correct. Canada was subsidizing media before there was a Canada. Literally before there was a Canada. And it took the form of postal subsidies because the distribution system of that time was the post office, right? So yes. So we've always kind of been inclined to support news organizations. But the fact of the matter is, I think we in Canada in particular should feel quite sheepish about not adjusting to a changing reality, because our communication scholar, Marshall McLuhan, warned us in the 1960s that the business model for mainstream media and newspapers in particular was done. And you mentioned classified ads. So think back to the old days of broadsheet newspapers. And, the whole advertising thing, the beer company ads and the shiny car ads, they were all important. But the absolute goldmine of a newspaper when I was, starting, were the classified ads.
I took a tour of the Edmonton Journal offices a few years ago, and they showed me several empty floors of a building that used to be full of people working on classified ads.
Yeah. And it was you and me, it was the ad that said golf clubs for sale, probably bought by some guy or woman that plays as badly as I do. And, got so frustrated, I get rid of those clubs. Right. But that was like the gold mine. But McLuhan in the 1960s said, if there's something that comes along that allows people to connect more directly with the folks that want to buy golf clubs, these ads will disappear and this industry will disappear. Well, hello, Kijiji, right?
Right.
It happened. But let's take a step back. So the internet's been a reality for everybody since the early 90s, right? So if you think about it, that means mainstream media companies had 30 years to think about another business model. But they were too wedded to the advertising flow that actually didn't start to tail off right away in the 90s. It kind of held through the early 2000s. And advertising, as media historians will remind us, is often seen as the midwife of modern journalism. Before advertising, the media was quite partisan, tended to be supported by political parties. And then along came advertising, and that, as you say, that allowed you not to have to pay for the news coverage. And I concede your point, and it's an important point. People were less interested in news than folklore would have you believe, right? It was always a little bit of a periphery. But they were interested in engagement, right? And the news decided to take a very specific route forward. And that was the route of informing society, right? And informing society meant giving society its sort of basic information. Here's what's going on in your community. Here's what's happening tomorrow. Here's what's going on in the country next door. But it was done in a certain way. And the scholar James Carey described it as a transmission model. And it was information sent out over, spaces, geography, for purposes of commerce and control, not to put too fine a point on it. And his argument was that missed the boat. That was the wrong call. That what media should have done is become an agency for the conversations of society. Because if you think about the media in historical context, very few voices, controlled by even fewer gatekeepers, who were disproportionately older white males. So that's what you got as a product. I remember as a political staffer in Brian Mulroney's prime minister's office, having conversations with my opposite numbers in the White House in the United States. And this would be in the mid 80s, just to help people situate it. And the Reagan administration, Ronald Reagan's administration, their sort of media outreach on any given week involved about 12 people. Okay? A correspondent from one of each of the big three networks, the three news magazines, so Time, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and then whatever big regional paper aligned with what the story was.
Right.
And they would connect with these people kind of midweek, Wednesday, Thursday. They'd have their kind of perspective shared with them. Those people would then write the columns for the weekend and or appear on the panel shows. And by Sunday, everybody was aware of what the agenda was for the administration for that week. But who wasn't part of that conversation, right? Racialized people, women to a large extent, the suburbs, youth. They just weren't part of the mix. In the old days when I worked at the Toronto Star, if you went to the Scarborough Bureau, literally we used to refer to it as Scarberia. Right? It was a sign that, things weren't going all that well for you. So you had this relatively small kind of circle. And part of what social media is doing is, okay, we're going to get more circles. So my argument is you're never going to sell the product that you have been producing going forward. So my premise is there is no market for news stories that have lead paragraphs where the last two words in the paragraph are said yesterday.
Right.
I know what Jason Kenney said yesterday because he tweeted it. I know what Doug Ford said yesterday. He tweeted it. I know what Jagmeet Singh wanted to say around the agreement with the government. He tweeted it. I want to know more than that. So to reduce it to kind of a bumper sticker, to me, where journalism has to go is less stenography, more journalism. Less said yesterday, more genuine inquiry that does two things. But above all else, focuses on verification. And there's lots of scholarship to this effect, that.
So help me work this through, Bill. Who covers the Planning Commission?
Today? Nobody.
In the future, in this world,
yeah. Well,
who's going to cover that?
Well, it's going to have to be. It's not going to be the big Star newsroom of 500 people that you described earlier, Toronto Star newsroom that you described earlier. It's not going to come from there, but it's also not going to be the kind of community bulletin board that some of the local media outlets that have stepped into the voids are going to, they're not going to meet that lead. frankly, it's going to have to be people like your guest of a few weeks ago, the Justin Lings of the world, who get out there, who invest the time, who invest the energy to actually get behind what is going on. In his case, the occupation of the streets of Ottawa. And I absolutely acknowledge that that's going to be a challenge, because we are not, used to paying for information. But we're not, the ad dollars that everybody talks about that subsidize news, they're gone. They are not coming back. They are with the big five, Facebook, Twitter, and they're never coming back. And the product that we're offering up today, because it is overly stenographic, I would argue, doesn't meet the value test. So people aren't going to pay for it, right? I'm only going to pay something extra if I think what I'm getting is of value. And that's not going to be an easy thing. And the media is probably going to be smaller, and there's probably going to be fewer voices. But you see lots of impressive kind of, startup subscription-based models, whether it's the Logic or Canada Land. I don't mean to exclude anybody from that, but, so it's doable. But as I say, the stenographic model, done, over, finished.
Herle Burlyites, we've been talking about Easter seals here for the last couple of weeks. 15% of Canadians are living with a disability, and it's a subject that's close to my heart, because my phenomenal brother-in-law, Stephen, is among that 15%. He spends a lot of time with Terry and I, and for that, we're grateful. Others aren't so fortunate. Canadians living with disabilities are twice as likely to be victims of violence, and they face significantly higher levels of unemployment than the general population. Easter Seals is Canada's largest provider of financial support, programs, services, and issues leadership and development for the disability community. They are a truly unstoppable force in communities all across our country, and you can see it and hear it in the work and stories of their ambassadors. Work that includes $50,000 in funded post-secondary scholarships each year. Advocacy and awareness when it's needed most, like after a pandemic that completely disrupts society. This year, they're focusing on increasing awareness of Easter Seals programs, as well as advocating for the implementation of the Canada Disability Benefit. And camp, one of the best parts of summer and childhood. Every summer, more than 6,000 children and youth living with disabilities attend one of Easter Seals' 17 specialized, fully accessible summer camps across Canada. Well, March is officially Easter Seals Month, and it's a special edition of Easter Seals Month because this year is their 100th anniversary. All year long, Easter Seals is celebrating their volunteers, families, and donors, but also dreaming big and planning for the decades to come. They want to be relevant for the next 100 years. Herle Burlyites, Easter Seals wants you to help celebrate this big birthday too. It's important that their good work and the ways they've affected your life gets out there. So please share your stories of their work in your community on your social channels. Reach out to volunteer in community events. Make a small donation or consider making your company a sponsor. Visit easterseals.com for all of that, or look for your local chapters on social media. Happy birthday, Easter Seals. Cheers to 100 years. But somebody has to bear witness, as you say in the book. And what's wrong? I know all that's wrong with government subsidization. But how can there be any answer? Because as you pointed out earlier, you need to cover the Planning Commission, because people don't care. For years and years, they may not care what happens at the Planning Commission. But then there's a scandal, and then they do care, and then they wish they knew. And somebody has to be there to cover that.
Yeah.
And who's going to pay that person?
Well, they're probably going to, it's probably going to be, they're probably going to have to pay themselves while they're doing that. I mean, the kind of the big media model, for instance, in the creative arts of television production doesn't exist either, right? If you think about Hollywood, if you think about movies, I think the statistic is, 80% of the companies in Hollywood have fewer than 4 people in, right? So you're going to have kind of an entrepreneurial approach to some of this, and you're going to have to understand that you may not get paid right away, and you may not get paid till you're down the road. But I do think that if you move to a different model of what you're offering people, they will be more inclined to kind of pay something for it. Because, again, if you think about, you mentioned witness, okay? And there's quite a spirited debate right now. People who resist the definition of journalists as storytellers. And our mutual friend Ellie Alboim is quite eloquent on this subject, and scholars like Jay Rosen at NYU equally so. And their worry is you start to tell the story, and the story bleeds into an acceptance of a kind of what Andy Tucker describes as a congenial truth. We kind of believe certain things, and then we get pretty selective about what facts we report, whether it's slanting or whatever, because we're looking for things that support that congenial truth, right? And so a lot of those people see it as a slippery slope, and they want journalism to still be witness. But here's my problem with that. And let's take political journalism as illustrative. How can you be a witness? If you're a political reporter in Ottawa, you can't go to caucus. You're not in the cabinet meeting. You don't have unfettered access to anybody in the PMO. You're only going to have access. You're not in the staff meetings in the opposition leader's office or any opposition party. So how much are you witness to, really? Right? So what happens then? Well, now you're relying on sources. Okay. Sources is a slippery slope, because, it's long been understood that news isn't what happens. News typically is what somebody said happened or has happened. Okay? Because I don't know what happened. I wasn't sitting there, unlike the planning board, right? So I'm relying on the source. Well, now the source, the scholars say they liken it to a dance, right? But there's no question about who's leading, right? The source leads. Now, David, I don't know this for a fact, but I am going to hazard a guess that in the course of your career, you might have been the source for a story or two over the years. And you would have given that information to somebody on the assumption that they were going to use it a certain way. And if you weren't happy with the way they used it, you found another ear to whisper into. So you were absolutely in control of that relationship. And that's why journalism, has got into this sort of accuracy mode, right? So I'm not saying it's true. I'm saying you said it's true.
So accuracy versus truth.
Yeah.
Bob Fife and I had a good conversation about this on this podcast about whether accuracy is enough or whether journalists needs to be looking for the truth.
Yeah. So
where are you on that?
I'm emphatically in the land of accuracy isn't enough. And I don't for one second question that the Bob Fifes of the world absolutely accurately record what they were told. But my argument would be going forward, that's not going to be good enough for political conversation, and it's not going to be good enough for political journalism. That you have to move to truth. That truth is the glue that holds society together. And I mean, again, let's take a step back. It's repeated like a mantra that journalism is fundamental to democracy.
Yes.
Right? That journalism is a primary site of civil conversation. Well, if that's true, then journalism needs to do more than accurately report what somebody said. Because Donald Trump figured out the advantage to him of a kind of accuracy very early on in his career. And he routinely made stuff up because he knew it was going to be absolutely accurately reported, right? And he used Twitter to great effect to set a news agenda that was predicated on an assumption that whatever he said would be accurately reported.
Yeah.
Right? And that's just not good enough. All right, in my view.
So when I was trying to land stories off the record or a deep background with journalists, I always felt as though they were looking at me, well, hungrily for a story for sure, but also skeptically. Understanding that I had a motivation, understanding that I had an agenda that I was trying to accomplish. And I didn't expect them to be completely willing accomplices in that. I expected that they were going to talk to other people and try to learn more about this. And that ultimately, while I was trying to win the frame, a concept that we'll come back to a little bit later, that I wasn't, my spin wasn't going to be the only or definitive source on the subject.
No, but when I say that the kind of the distribution system has led to a discourse shift. So your assumption would have been absolutely correct in a legacy or a traditional media universe where there were more resources, where there was more time. I mean, when I was the bureau chief in Ottawa for the Toronto Star, we had 5 editions a day, right? And we thought we were hard done by because most newspapers didn't have that many editions. Well, think about a world of Twitter, where forget rapid response, it's real-time response. Yeah. And there's so much pressure on fewer journalists to produce more product that they've got away from, in effect, road testing your storyline. They haven't had the luxury to talk to enough people to find out if it's true. And they have to strike a very delicate balance. When I made the reference to the source leads the dance, so a journalist finds him or herself in a position where they've got to tell the reader, viewer, listener enough about the source so you can figure out the motive, but not so much that you burn the source or not so much that you cause the source to go elsewhere. And it's a very fine line, and especially when it involves a judgment. And one of the specifics that I reflect on a bit is the whole circumstance around Judy Wilson-Raybould, where the story was, that she was pressured, a very specific word. Well, and I take it as an absolute given that whoever talked to the journalists about that used that word. That's not, but pressured is a subjective descriptive by definition, right? Mm-hmm. So one person's pressure is something else. And so you wanted to know a little more about the source because that's the person that made the assessment that this constituted pressure. And I give the Globe and Mail full credit because the sources weren't identified, as is very often the case. But the Globe's public editor, Sylvia Stead, wrote a very interesting and thoughtful piece about here's how this kind of works. Here are the deliberations internally. If we say it, if you don't name the source, don't assume we don't know who it is. We do. Don't assume we don't know about their back. We do. But that's kind of tricky ground. And it gets trickier when you don't have the luxury of a little more time. It gets trickier when you're in a highly competitive environment, because if I'm working at the Globe and Mail, I'm preoccupied with what, other news organizations, CBC, CTV, Toronto Star, what they're up to. And I don't want to be, caught short, and I don't want to be caught flat-footed. So they have my sympathy, but that's also part of the reason why I think, okay, so move up the value chain. Don't do the said yesterday. Tell me something I'm not going to know unless I read your piece. And that's where I think we got to get to. And, the kind of ritual model is what it's described as. And basically what it says is, why don't you create a space for the conversation? Why don't you stop trying to tell me what's yesterday? And why don't you create a space for conversation? Because, I was at this event at Carleton, and there was a First Nations leader named Gwen Phillips who spoke. And it's burned in my brain. Her comment at one point was, be careful with your words, because words create worlds. And that's what a media conversation, however you describe it, that's its potential. It creates the world we then take up residence in. And so words matter, and context matters, and inquiry matters. And the kind of the bulletin, what should an editorial product look like? One, its obligation is to truth. Two, its loyalty is to the reader. And three, its essence or its soul is the art of verification. And that's where I think we got to get to.
When I think about those things, truth and obligation to the reader, how much can journalists allow themselves to care about the consequences of their story?
Well, I think
does that create context around what you do and do not report or say?
Well, I think that I don't think it's a matter of their consciences should be clear if they have met the test of genuine inquiry.
So an example that's on my mind is this. Everybody that interacts with Joe Biden says he has moments where he looks very old.
Yeah.
Moments where he appears to lose his train of thought. Moments where he's lost in his own mind. Moments where he's very inarticulate. Fox News shows me those clips. CNN and MSNBC much less likely to show me those clips.
Yeah, and I think that's a regrettable development of this kind of gotcha journalism and kind of clickbait journalism, right?
But if I thought that the consequence of showing those clips was that Donald Trump would be the president again.
Yeah, but if you're a Fox viewer, that's not problematic.
Right.
Right.
But if I work for CNN and I think that Trump winning again would be pretty close to a global catastrophe, how much do I want to show people that Biden is maybe not able to do this job?
Well, so I think because if you didn't, you wouldn't be meeting the first obligation, which is to truth. I mean, if those of us who are aging, those are realities, and you do nobody a service by skating around them. When I was a White House correspondent, I wrote stories about then President Reagan and some of the kind of similar concerns about him. That's what you're there to do. So I'm not talking about pulling your punches, or I'm not talking about a skewered view of the world, because I don't think that helps anybody. But I'm also talking about genuine inquiry. And genuine inquiry means listening to other people. When I worked in politics in the Prime Minister's office, in the Director of Communications slot in particular, it used to drive me crazy when I'd run into other directors of communication to ministers of the crown who would loudly proclaim that they didn't, read such and such a publication. Like it was a badge of honor. I don't read this there. I don't read. And I think to myself, boy, you're lucky you're not working with me because you wouldn't be here tomorrow. How do you think you're doing your job if you don't know about the conversation that's going on there?
I don't read the Sun out of pleasure, but when I'm running a campaign, I read the Sun.
You read the Sun, of course you do, because you have to. And a big part of populism is people feeling that they were marginalized, people feeling that they weren't part of the conversation, people feeling that their concerns and their aspirations weren't being addressed by anybody that was, running for office. And the same thing happens here, right? We slide over whole communities routinely, and they're not part of the conversation. So if you don't feel you're part of the conversation, then why would you think you're invested in the outcome of that conversation, which is, democracy?
Well, that takes me, Bill, to the concept of truth and what it is. And it's in the title of your book. And, there's great concern. Justin Ling and I, you're right, had a great conversation about misinformation or disinformation that exists out there circulating on the internet that is influencing people and their behavior. So that's pretty obvious. Misinformation, things that are clearly wrong, provably wrong. But what about the, as you describe them, congenial truths that permeate normal media coverage of things that may not feel true to people either? So free trade and globalization create prosperity. Immigration is only good for the economy. Education is the route to a better life. A rising tide lifts all boats. These premises permeate normal media coverage. But there's lots of people out there that would look at that and say, that's not true either.
Yeah. So let me make the first assertion I would make in answering, your observations is, and I'll quote a former editor of the Toronto Star, Borden Spears. Truth is cumulative. Truth's not a one-off. There's not one story that's the truth. This isn't Moses. People don't come down from a mountain with 2 rocks and 10 rules, and this is the way it is, right? Truth is work. The columnist David Frum refers to it as a process. Now, process is one of those words that causes people's eyes to glaze over, although as a sports fan, I find it's being used increasingly in reportage around teams these days. But it is cumulative. And you got to go to more than one source, and you got to read more than one perspective. You got to know what's on CNN, but you also have to know what's on Fox, because that's the view of the world that certain people have. And by certain people, I don't mean that in a disparaging way. I'm not, this isn't Hillary Clinton's deplorables. These are pockets, of the community that have conversations that you need to be aware of. And so that would be the first point I make, that, truth is cumulative. And then the other point I would make is that if you change the model, because what's the problem with the top-down model, right? The one that we've all used since the telegraph, right? It's that there's an assumption of authority. There's an assumption of there's only one way around this. There's assumption of this, there's only this set of facts. Whereas if you move to the ritual kind of conversation model, you say there's all kinds of perspectives here. And one of the more interesting, to me, conversations that is happening in the media world is around the notion of objectivity, right? Journalists of a certain age grew up believing in objectivity. And it was, as our friend Eli Abouam would say, Robert Heinlein's, stranger in a strange land, fair witness. And that, as an impartial person, I came to this and I saw this. Well, for racialized journalists, they're in the land of, well, I don't know. As one UBC scholar so brilliantly put it, objectivity is the view from nowhere. And everybody comes from somewhere. Right. So how do you achieve it? How is it possible? Right. And so you that undermines this notion of there is but one version. If you don't accept the notion of objectivity, there can't be one version. Right. So then you got to get to there are a lot of versions. It's like a prism, right? And everybody looks at it through a different panel, and everybody's convinced they're looking at the right thing. And everybody's convinced they're looking at truth. And it would be more accurate to say they're looking at their truth. As a white male of a certain age, our mutual friend Alan Gregg argues, if you're a white male born in Canada right after the war, Second World War, as I was, there's perhaps no demographic in the history of the world more privileged, right? We came of age in a time when economies were growing, access to education was eased. The introduction of Medicare meant we weren't saddled with big medical bills. Travel was cheap. Jobs were plentiful. You might not get the job, but you were going to get a job. It wasn't a debatable point. So, things are pretty good, right? And then you think of yourself as being in a competitive environment, but you're competitive with a bunch of like-minded souls. Whereas other people would argue, well, that system, classic 18th century liberal democracy, John Locke, John Stuart Mill, is actually systemic racism. And as systemic racism, it's basically white supremacy. Now, you say that to somebody at my age and stage, and I kind of recoil in horror because I don't see myself as that. I don't see people who espouse that philosophy as seeing it that way. And I don't see journalists of a certain era who espouse largely the progressive movement's attitudes. They don't see themselves as being part of a system of systemic racism. So you got to have that conversation. Those other communities have to say, no, here's how and here's why. And we have to be part of it. So that's why I think we got to move off what we're doing. And, I guarantee you, I'll hear from friends of mine saying, what kind of Pollyannish view of the world do you have? Like, people are not going to buy that.
It's what you're known for, Bill.
And my argument back would be, and it's always with the punchline of, Bill, there's no point in preaching to an empty church. Well, my pushback would be, look around. Church pretty empty already. What you're doing is not working.
So Facebook and Twitter seem like pretty good places to have that kind of wide-ranging, inclusive conversation. But they are the villains of this story, not the heroes of this story. So for somebody who doesn't understand what an algorithm is, what is Facebook doing wrong to put its finger on the scale?
Well, a number of things. First of all, let me separate them, okay? And let me preface what I'm about to say by saying, I subscribe to the view that has been articulated by many people, including Clay Shirky, that you need to see the media as an ecosystem, that there is no one component part that operates in isolation. So for purposes of my discussion, I settled on Twitter because that's a kind of a meeting point where journalism and politics happens. It's a place where a lot of political conversation occurs, and therefore a lot of political coverage starts to take shape. And frankly, it's also a place where there have been some academic studies of note that give you a kind of a parameters for the conversation. But Twitter needs the rest of the ecosystem too. So I argue that, Donald Trump was quite successful getting our attention, right? And he used Twitter to do that. But he didn't just get it because of Twitter. He put a tweet out. The mainstream media would then pick up on the tweet and would amplify it. And I may not have heard about it from Twitter, but I heard about the tweet from the mainstream media. So
only 10% of people are even on Twitter, and many fewer check it on a regular basis. So.
Exactly. And people check into it, sporadically, right? So that's why I say, so it is an ecosystem, and the one feeds off the other. But having said that, and it's interesting, it loops back to our conversation about accuracy. Trump understood the ability for him to make news on Twitter, right? And he would use that. And he'd use it in a couple of ways. If he was stuck in a conversation he didn't want to have, he'd change the channel. So at one point, he was stuck in a conversation about guns that he didn't want to have. So in the middle of the night, he puts out a tweet that says, we're going to buy Greenland. Right? And everybody says, what? What's Greenland got to do with it?
Right.
And then we all go firing around about,
And he didn't have to involve any machinery of government to create an announcement to change the channel.
None.
Right?
I guarantee his staff was blissfully unaware that he thought America should buy Greenland. Right.
Right. And
then the story gets legs. So then somebody phones the Prime Minister of Denmark and says, are you going to sell Greenland? And she says, well, actually, Greenland's not for sale. And then Trump counters by saying, well, I was going to make an official visit to Denmark, but no, I'm not, if she's not going to sell me Greenland. And we're 3 days into this absurd kind of exchange. But you know what we're not doing? We're not talking about guns. Right? His other way of using it was, he used a term from the game of football, right? Flood the zone. And for non-football fans, basically that just means the offense designates multiple receivers to run to a particular spot where there's only one defender, and the premise is one defender can't cover all these people. And it's called flooding the zone, right? And Steve Bannon, one of Trump's advisors, said, we routinely flood the zone. And his direct quote was basically, and we flood the zone with bullshit. Right? But the accuracy press is so busy kind of recording that it suits its objective. Now, I'm prepared to not only listen to, but maybe even agree with the counter argument that says Trump was successful at getting attention, but he wasn't necessarily successful in media relations terms because a lot of the attention he got was negative. But he was successful in driving a news agenda. He de facto became the assignment editor for mainstream media, and he was effective at changing the channel. All of which he used Twitter for, all of which was supported by other media. Now, Facebook's a different proposition. Facebook, I would argue, has a fundamental conceit. And that conceit is, we're not a media company, we're just a distribution channel. We're just a system. And once you log into that, you have to then refuse any suggestion that you have a responsibility for the accuracy or veracity of anything in your system, because you've said you're not a media company.
Right.
So you become hostage to your own rhetoric, right? And yet You have algorithms, and algorithms are the secret sauce.
And what are they?
Well, who knows? That's the point. I don't know. I don't know what the component parts of an algorithmic calculation are that determine in the end what I see and what I don't see. And, my friend, an internet strategist named Jesse Hirsch, has always pointed out, Facebook isn't what your friends post that you want to see. Facebook is, they decide what you will see about what your friends posted. It's a fundamental difference. And that's why, there's a lot of people that are.
So really, if they're not reporters, they're at least editors.
Yeah. By definition, I would argue if you've got an algorithm, that is an editorial function.
Right.
And therefore, this assertion that you're not a media company doesn't stand up to any scrutiny at all. But make no mistake about the impact of those kinds of channels. I mean, the Robert Mueller inquiry in the United States, which the mainstream media dismissed as a bit of a bust because they didn't have the headline that they were anticipating, nonetheless came up with really important findings, not the least of which is Russia bombarded the United States electorate with thousands and thousands of messages that were seen by in excess of 100 million people. So literally, I think the number worked out to be like more than half the American electorate saw these false messages. Well, that's an interference with democracy. That's something that should concern us. And that's something that journalism should be, examining in some significant detail. And don't mishear me, David. I'm not like, everybody will be able to phone me tomorrow and say, hey, Fox, you missed this story that appeared on such and such a date in The Economist on all true. But there's not enough of it, I guess I would argue. And we need more people engaged in that different kind of conversation.
So what's to be done about Facebook, Bill? I mean, it seems to me it's an inherent monopoly. Like if there were 10 Facebooks, none of them would be Facebook because the idea of Facebook is that everybody's on it. You can reach everybody through it. So it seems like it's an inherent monopoly. I mean, should it be nationalized? How could it be regulated? What could be done?
Well, when I talk about we need to have, political conversations, that's a perfect example of the conversation we should have. And we shouldn't, the problem with it is, and it goes back to political discourse and political communication, right? Political leadership is always reluctant to speak to a problem until and unless they feel they have a solution. So they want it in effect to be bracketed. Here's the problem, here's my answer. But some of the things are broader than that. And some of the things take more time than that. And some of the things require input from too many people for that to work effectively. And this is one of those areas I would suggest to you. Like, instead of having parliamentary committees pick away at, some of the things they do, why wouldn't we have parliamentary committees look at these big issues? The Broadcast Act in Canada was passed in 1991. Okay? It doesn't even include a reference to the internet. The CBC mandate does not include any reference to any of their digital products. Why is it 30 years old? Why do we, people like Elizabeth Dubois at the University of Ottawa have long, asked, why do we have a regulatory system for a media system that doesn't exist anymore? What's the magic of that? So why not have those conversations, community conversations? Why not have, the Facebook people, not just in an adversarial kind of confrontational way, but be part of that broader conversation? Because I don't think it's an easy answer necessarily. I just know that if we don't do something we will lose all measure of control. Now, I had one little idea, and all it did was generate eye rolls. People think I'm wacky about it. But in the early 1990s, we in Canada developed a system called Canary. And it was an internet-based system that allowed research institutes, universities, a kind of a common space to share information, to share, right? Well, why not take Canary and extend it? Why not have a channel in Canada that is unique to Canada to guarantee that there's always one site for civic discourse in Canada? Why not?
Right.
I mean, we spend money on everything else.
Never heard of that before reading the book.
You know, like, why not? And by the way, you know, this Canary system, this was developed by public servants like Michael Bender and people like that, like way before there was a Facebook and way before it was Twitter. So we have the expertise to do things like that. We just need to give them the opportunity to do it and fund them to do it.
Well, we're talking about assets that we currently hold. In this world where all kinds of aspects of the information model are falling apart, we in Canada have this asset called the CBC that we spend $1 billion or more on, public dollars on annually. That seems like it is the most antiquated response possible to what's going on right now. What is the best use that Canada could make of either the CBC or that $1 billion to address what's going on in media and information?
Well, so I have a fundamental conflict that I should declare. My wife, Bonnie Brownlee, worked at the CBC up until about a year ago. So everybody needs to know that. The public broadcaster and the notion of a public broadcaster was created as a direct response to technological change in the early part of the 20th century around things like radio, right? And people were worried that we would be swamped by signals and news and current affairs and entertainment from the United States of America. And that's a legitimate concern because, you know, the United States produces more culture, however you define it, for broadcast and dissemination than any other place in the world. So why wouldn't we just, in effect, have a new conversation about that and say, all right, but all of that world has changed. So what should we be doing with our public broadcaster that meets this emerging circumstance? And you've got to start with, should we even have a public broadcaster? Now, I'm not a fan of, you know, people who want to, you know, kind of defund news and current affairs and, you know, do this, and you shouldn't be in that business. And, you know, and I'm not that sympathetic, I have to admit, to private broadcasters whining and whinging about CBC ad dollars either. But I do think that you have an entity that has the potential to be the agency or a lead agency for the conversation I was talking about that isn't doing that. And so I think if we're going to have one, if we're going to have a public broadcaster at all, it's got to be in the demonstrable interest of the public that supports it. And where it gets tricky is, for instance, I mentioned earlier journalistic communities that reject the notion of objectivity and say we need to be an activist, we need activist journalism. Okay. Let's say that's the way you want to go. Well, what happens if Canadians democratically vote for change at the national level with their federal government. Does that new government then get to define what constitutes activism? You know, it's a slippery slope. So that's why I always keep coming back to this: create the space, create the conversation, facilitate the conversation, use genuine inquiry. Because, you know, it's funny, there's a little controversy on Twitter this morning being a Wednesday morning, where a CBC reporter was following the opposition leader, Candice Bergen's response to the Liberal NDP deal. And the reporter was literally just providing us with a verbatim account of what Bergen was saying. And it triggered some, you know, what are you doing? You know, what are you, a propagandist for Candice Bergen? And of course, the answer was, no, I'm just, you know, recording what she said. But that's stenography. I don't need a public broadcaster to record what Candice Bergen says. Her party will provide me with verbatim information about what it is she's saying. I need something else.
What about the old of record thing? Like, we're the newspaper of record.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think people in Canada understand how fragile the remaining newspapers in Canada are. Like, it's not inconceivable that there are none in 10 years.
Yeah.
Right? Not the Globe, not the Star, not La Presse, gone, all of them.
Yes.
The Globe is a philanthropic exercise by the Thompson family, as near as I understand it.
Yeah.
So don't we still need, like, the New York Times seems like it will always exist as the place where you can go and have a pretty definitive account of what happened. Is that a function CBC should be playing?
Well, let me begin by pointing out to you that, you know, a leading United States newspaper, the Boston Globe, announced in 2017 that it would no longer be a newspaper of record. And the Boston Globe, you know, you'll remember they're the people who won the Pulitzer Prize for investigating the Catholic Church in Boston. You know, it's a long and distinguished history. But it decided it was no longer in the newspaper of record business, that it would be in another business. And the other business was more the business of inquiry. So I think it's an open question whether any news organization is ever going to have the kind of resources that are required to be the media entity of record. And in the specific of the CBC, for instance, you know, some years ago, the CBC decided basically to vacate local news for all intents and purposes. Well, so they're not going to be at the planning board. Now, there's been some shift back around that, but you know, they've already vacated that space. And I can't emphasize enough how critically important the disappearance of newspapers is to our society, to our community, and to our country. And I'm going to sound like an old ink-stained Gretsch, which I am, and I concede that. But, you know, a disproportionate amount of the information that becomes the foundation of our political discussions comes from newspapers. Okay. It was always the newspaper that was at the planning board at the township of Nepean or the township of Gloucester in Ottawa in the 1960s. Sometimes there was a CBC reporter there. Sometimes there was a private radio reporter there. Sometimes there was a CTV reporter there. But all the time, the print people were there. And those stories, when I talked about a lot of editorial content being derivative, they provided the 10% that fed off, you know, the rest of the media ecosystem. You know, talk radio is predicated on the assumption that we've all read something first. Yes. Right? Otherwise, it's incoherent. Otherwise, it doesn't mean anything to anybody. Right. Well, if the newspapers go, who's going to provide that foundation? Where does the base come from? And if it's as fundamental to democracy as we insist it is, then why don't we treat it as an expression of democracy? And why don't we do some things such as make subscriptions to Canadian news organizations tax deductible? If I send the Conservative Party a few bucks, if I send the NDP a few bucks, if I send the Liberal Party a few bucks, I get a tax receipt. If I send a few bucks to the Globe and Mail and a few bucks to the Toronto Star, why wouldn't I get a tax receipt? Right. And the other thing about it that I believe really, really profoundly is whatever you're going to do, it's got to be universal. You know, one of the things I struggled with the early kind of iterations of what Ottawa intended to do to help media was that, you know, they were going to have committees and the committees were going to decide who was eligible and who was going to be on the committee. You know, like.
But don't you have to create a set of rules that makes the Globe eligible and Rebel Media not eligible?
No. And I say that as somebody that takes the most profound exception to what the Rebel is, does, and says. But you cannot get into that kind of censorship. That's exactly what would happen if you have committees making decisions about who gets it. And the problem with that is, you know, attitudes change, things change, and you know, the definition of what's acceptable can change. Now, we have laws to protect us on the basis of hate speech. So I'm not advocating for hate speech. And any organization that indulges in hate speech can be addressed on that basis. But I don't want a startup from a racialized community in a metropolitan area penalized because they're not the Toronto Star. I want them to have, you know, exactly the same access to whatever it is we're going to do as the Toronto Star has. Because otherwise, how are they going to get going? You know?
So what you're telling me, Bill, in the book and through this whole discussion, is that you're either not interested or don't believe it is possible to try to save what we had, to try to go back to the 1960s through 80s of journalism. And so we really have to reinvent and create this thing, that the same functions remain essential to democracy, but there's no point trying to save the Globe. We've got to move forward in our thinking about this. Am I right?
Well, what I'm saying is the Globe can save itself. So, because look, technology dictates a whole bunch of things, right? And McLuhan and Harold Innis, you know, I mean, we've got such great scholarship in Canada in this area, you know. I mean, let me give you a specific illustration. Let's take newspapers. Okay. News stories were written to a certain style for newspapers. And that style was called an inverted pyramid. And you organize the information in the story in an inverted pyramid fashion. So that the kind of highlight reel was at the top, and then you got down into the mice type and other bits of information were there. What is the genesis of the inverted pyramid writing style? Telegraphy. It was a writing style designed to address the reality of telegraph services at that time, which were emerging, that had a tendency to get, you know, wires came down and things got cut off. So the inverted pyramid style was, if we lose the signal, in effect, you will have a layered thing. Okay, but you know what? We don't use telegraphy anymore. So why are we still writing with an inverted pyramid style? What's that about? Why aren't we writing in another style? And so that's all I'm saying. Like, move with the times. Don't be sitting there doing the woe is me. Don't be sitting there whining about the 6-team NHL. You know,
it was better.
I mean, TikTok, has created platforms for all kinds of people that could not find voice prior to that. Twitter, for all its faults, is still an interesting place to monitor political conversations. Facebook, for all its issues, still has a distribution capability, the likes of which the world has never seen. So I guess I'm kind of saying, instead of in the world of lead, follow, or get out of the way, lead. And I would argue our mainstream media companies haven't.
You're most decidedly a capitalist, but you don't think we get to. You don't think we have to leave this to Jesus? What the hell is the guy? Facebook owner's name? Why am I forgetting that right now?
Zuckerberg.
Yeah. What? Like, I mean, just because he invented it, he doesn't get to control it, does he? It's too big a thing.
Well, we look, that's a whole separate discussion. Elizabeth Warren often said that, when corporations get to the size that they can threaten the state, you got yourself a big problem. And people who've done excellent work in the United Kingdom, for example, believe fundamentally that these major social media companies have absolutely destroyed democracy in that country. And they argue that the UK is the canary in the coal mine, and the rest of us should be paying attention to what went on there. So I guess my suggestion would be, what you can't do is let them regulate themselves. This notion of, they'll respond to some higher calling, no. But having said that, Google and people like that, their future and their executives speak to this directly, is quite tied to news. Like they need news as part of the mix. And they're happy to freeload if they can.
They need shareables.
Absolutely. And so the conversations are going to happen. And then it's just a matter of, is it going to happen here or is it going to happen there? And you want to make sure that it happens here.
This is the title of the book. Trump Trudeau tweets truth at conversation. Tell me why you chose that title.
So the real a newspaper person would say I buried the lead. That what I wanted to do was to try and trigger a conversation, and I got the idea from a very specific situation. A few years back, I had the honor to be teaching a course in strategic communications in the Riddell Graduate Program of Political Management at Carleton University. And it was it was during presidential primary season, right? And so I, as the leader of the group, went on at exhaustive length as to why Donald John Trump could not and would not be elected president of the United States.
Yeah, sure. It's impossible.
Not ever. Okay. And even as I was holding forth, there was, kind of a little chirping from the students who were, polite enough not to say you're full of it, but, they give you that look that tells you they think you're full of it. And two things struck me about those exchanges. The first was they were from students who would be philosophically not aligned. So students from the left were challenging that assertion as much as students from the right. And the second thing was often their source material were voices and social media platforms that I, at my age, was not familiar with. And so the conversation in the course of the year was tremendously helpful to me personally. And so that's where I sort of got the conversation, the idea, that, and I hope, the students got something from me too, but that's where I got this idea, like, we need to talk about this. My point of departure was political discourse and political journalism both need an upgrade, and we should have a conversation about how best to do that. Because I don't absolve the political side from some of the things I've talked about in terms of the impact on political discourse. If I see one more party representative on a panel show, repeating their 3 talking points like a parrot, I'm going to go crazy.
Why are the media putting them up?
Well, I wouldn't. Right. And here's what's interesting. So
I don't actually blame them for reiterating the talking points. If they don't do that, they'll lose their job. The question is, why does anybody think that's newsworthy?
It's not. And why does anybody think it's of value? I don't think it is. Because, it's interesting. At one point in my life, I was on one of those panels, one of the early ones, the CTV political panel. And I inherited the spot from my friend and former business partner, Hugh Siegel, who had gone into the Prime Minister's office. And when I got in to take Huey's place, the other panelists were Michael Kirby, who was a senator and liberal strategist of some significant renown, and Jerry Kaplan, who had been an activist, advisor, policy person for the NDP for years and years and years. And when I came into it, basically the network said 2 things to me. The first was, this thing is a hit, so don't screw it up. Your only job is not to cough up a hairball. Okay. And the second thing was, we're not here to listen to you tout the party line. You're here because you have a certain background, you have a certain experience set, you've got a perspective on things, and that's what we want. We don't want to nobody used the term talking points in those days. But in essence, the network said to me, don't bring your talking points. Well, we lost sight of it.
That panel is the model for cursive politics, Bill. You know that.
Well, I thought it might be. But, so I don't think that helps anybody. The kind of, and I understand how it comes to pass. And the old, communication theory of, no fewer than 3 points, no more than 5, and just repeat them. And right at the point where the audience thinks it's, somebody screeching their nails on a blackboard and the audience starts to scream, you're just starting to get through. I get all that. But, it's a different universe now. Although, interestingly enough, old theories stand up. So in the 1930s, Harold Laswell basically said political communication involves this. Who says what, to whom, through which channel, and to what effect? Well, the same rules apply today. The who can be more numerous than was the past. Says what, I would argue, has to change away from talking points to engagement. Through what channel is clearly more complicated because there's way more channels. And to what effect is the same, same old. Like, so it's interesting to me that, as much as I talk about, and we'd all understand this is a new universe and a different world but some of the old principles apply just as well today as it did then, and so I just think we just owe it to ourselves to have a richer and more interesting set of conversations for politics. But that and Trudeau tweets. Their media tends to be leader-centric. So, a prime minister and a president obviously fit that thing. And tweets only because I couldn't be exhaustive about it. I couldn't do Twitter. And so I just picked Twitter on the basis of it's one of the feeder systems for the media ecosystem.
Bill, I think we have to stop, only because at some point you have to stop, right? Like, I don't know what the rules are of these things, but I'm enjoying this so much. I could keep going on, and you and I have had many longer conversations than this. But thanks for doing this. And so interesting. The book is really interesting. And, there's something Bill and I didn't get to talk about here, but if you're interested in politics and political choice, you really should read what Bill has to say about framing and the framing of issues, because it's poorly understood by people who are non-communications practitioners, but it has so much influence on what you think about and how you think about those things and what range of options your brain is allowed to consider. Really important concept in media and communications, and that's an aspect of this book we didn't get to. One of a million reasons why everybody should buy this book. It's Bill's second book, by the way. His first one was called Spin Wars, also an excellent book, probably still available somewhere, but well before the internet times. Bill, as you know, I'm your biggest fan in the world. You've taught me so much over the years. I'm absolutely thrilled that you spent this time with me, and that I believe I'm the first interview on your book promotional tour. So that's a real honor for me, and thank you for bestowing.
You are indeed. And thank you, David, for the opportunity to have this conversation. And if I may, I'll leave it with just a very quick reference to the phenomenon of framing that you're talking about. I would encourage your list, think about the pandemic. Think about vaccines. Think about, you have that conversation if the framing is public health. And think about how the conversation is different if the framing is freedom.
Absolutely. Perfect. All right. Thank you, Bill. Thank you to our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and to CN, and to our special sponsor, Easter Seals, for their help in putting on this podcast. Thank you to all the Herle Burlyites out there for watching or listening to the show. And Bill, I'll catch up with you as soon as you're back in Toronto.
Look forward to it.